This is Professor Ludlum. This is the Law of International Business Transactions, LS 4533. Today we're looking at Chapter 14, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, remember, we've made all these agreements through GATT and WTO about encouraging free trade, reducing trade barriers. Doesn't it naturally conflict if we make a special agreement with Mexico and Canada that harms all the other countries? Well, GATT actually encourages this. Again, statement in Article 24 that none of their policies are to prevent the formation of a customs union or free trade area. In other words, the mindset is if America can get together with Mexico and Canada and reduce its trade barriers, then eventually that group may expand, and maybe we may add South America, maybe we may trade with Europe. Again, it benefits everyone in the long run because it encourages a larger and larger group of trade that has fewer and fewer barriers. I see this over and over again in the text as well as in articles where it says NAFTA was created by President Clinton. That's just a mistake. NAFTA was created by the president before him, George H.W. Bush, in '92. The reason why they describe it as being a Clinton idea is he was president when it became effective. So it was signed into law in '92, then it became in force in '94, by which time President Clinton had come to office. In fact, if you doubt me, this is the picture of NAFTA agreement being signed. The leaders of Mexico on the left, United States in the middle, Canada on the right, and you'll notice it's not President Clinton, it's President Bush, the first one. And he's the one that agreed to the law. It just took several years to become in force, and by which time we'd had another election. Now, why is this a good free trade agreement? It's because it's natural. Who are your biggest trading partners? For 99% of the countries on Earth, your biggest trading partners are your next door neighbors. And that's certainly true with the United States. Canada has by far been our largest trading partner since 1776. They always have been. Mexico is number 3. And to be cynical, my guess is if we counted, marijuana and those type of things, it would probably move up to number 2. But for whatever reasons, we don't count some of those. But certainly look at the ties between America and Mexico. 80% of Mexican exports come to the U.S. and 49% of Mexico's imports come from the U.S. So a huge impact despite all the other countries on Earth. So Canada's number 1 for America, Mexico's number 3, and China slips in at number 2. But again, that's been a very recent trade. Again, NAFTA is not a customs union or a common market like the EU. And to be as subtle as I can, that's likely a good test question. What's the difference between a customs union and a common market? And so check out your vocabulary. The idea is, or at least the way it's described, is use national treatment. In other words, treat the goods from any of the NAFTA countries the same as though they were domestically produced. Or again, put into example, we treat goods that are made in America no differently than goods that are made in Canada or made in Mexico because of the NAFTA agreement. We treat them the same. That doesn't mean there's no taxes on any of these goods. It means if there are taxes on the goods, we would tax American goods the same way. So American-made cigarettes are subject to tax. So Canadian-made cigarettes will be subject to the same tax. Mexico's cigarettes would be subject to the same tax. Right, that's national treatment. You've got to have a certificate of origin. In other words, you've got to have identification marks on the goods and the shipping containers for the goods that indicates it's a NAFTA-based good. These are some of the examples that I caught. Again, these are from new automobiles. And if you talk to the car dealer, they describe that this is our NAFTA sticker. And again, you put it on there because it demonstrates what part of the goods. In this example, 80% of it's US or Canada, 15% Japan, and the other 5% obviously has to be somewhere. It's just assorted other countries. But with those small amounts, we just disregard them. And so 80% of the goods are US or Canada, and as such, they're exempt from any kind of import tax. 15% of the value of the car could be taxed because it comes from Japan. Here's another automobile. US Canada parts 12%, Japan 36%, Mexico 42%, and so 54% of the value of the good is not taxed. The remaining 36% is taxed at whatever rate we tax Japanese goods. We also have different kinds of standards or regulations that deal with the labeling of goods. Again, the book talks about the Skippy peanut butter case, and they wanted to use a Made in USA label when most of the good was actually produced in Canada and then reduced to its final form inside the United States. And so there was a dispute about could they describe it as a Made in USA good. But again, when you think about products that go through multiple stages of the production process, it may be partially produced in China and then assembled here and then finally packaged in Brazil. So is it a Chinese good, an American good, or a Brazilian good? And you may want to label it one or the other for various marketing reasons. Again, the idea is with NAFTA we have free trade among our countries and no discrimination between an American producer, a Mexican producer, or a Canadian producer. Government procurement is always an issue, and again, this is when our government is buying things for our government to use for its own purposes. That basically it can have a local bias. It can overtly discriminate and say, because the U.S. government is buying these goods, it must be from a U.S. producer. Again, but as long as the goods are over $50,000 or a construction project over $6.5 million, you have to freely let the market decide between American, Mexican, and Canadian producers of those goods. Smaller than that, you can openly discriminate on the basis of preference for your local producers. We've had quite an ongoing dispute for years dealing with cross-border trucking, and my guess is you've seen the newscast, all the rumors that Mexican trucking companies don't have brakes and all these kind of far-fetched ideas, and we find out an awful lot of those originate from the American Trucking Union. Again, when we're talking about imports and exports, it's not just goods but also services like shipping and insurance and banking and all those kind of things. And most of them don't want any more competitors than they already have. And so cross-border trucking has been a huge fight between America and Mexico. One thing that's also been good as far as the NAFTA agreement is we set up arbitration panels instead of going to court, because again, the fear is always if we have to go, an American firm has to go to Canada to sue a Canadian company, we won't get a fair opportunity. Or if we have to go to Mexico to sue a Mexican company, we won't get a fair opportunity. But if we have an arbitration panel that's selected in conjunction with all the parties, then we can get a fair shake. Everybody can get a fair hearing. And so arbitration has been a very successful deal with the NAFTA agreement. That's not to say there's no disputes, but it means in arbitration they're done very quickly, less expensively, and more privately than they would be through the court system. And it certainly removes the inference that you're getting the hometown deal and the outsiders being treated unfairly. For example, it's not just the idea of taxes and those kind of things. You have to deal with all these other domestic issues. For example, America has a 40-hour work week and overtime thereafter. Mexico has a 48-hour work week. So if you're producing your goods in America and also have a factory in Mexico, you may have to have very different labor regulations, regulating the workplace and safety rules and all these kind of things. It's not just as easy as, oh, well, we're partners in NAFTA, we can do exactly the same thing. Each country still has their domestic rules relating to labor and the rights of the worker and those kinds of issues. Now, everyone's big concern when we started with NAFTA is what's going to happen to the American job market. Aren't we going to lose all of our jobs and they'll go to Mexico because the cost of labor is cheaper? At least that was one of the assumptions or the big worries. Honestly, as it turns out, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. What we've noticed is the Maquiladora, I think I'm pronouncing that right, region of northern Mexico where they set up lots and lots of American company factories to take advantage of the cheap Mexican workforce, but still close enough to America to make the transportation costs easy. The problem is once they made those factories in Mexico and started getting benefits of the cheaper labor cost, they realized they could put the factory anywhere, that they could physically move the goods back and forth. And what's happened in recent years is the rise of China. And as a result, what we've seen, strangely enough, is that an awful lot of those factories in the Maquiladora areas have closed because they found that it's too expensive to produce in Mexico. It's much cheaper to produce the goods in China. Even with the higher transportation costs, you still end up at a better financial position by producing them there as opposed to producing them in Mexico. So I guess the final answer is, is NAFTA going to harm the U.S. economy? Not really. The jobs that we lose to Mexico because of NAFTA, we were going to lose to China, and certainly have lost to China since then. Mexico was just an intermediary step before the factories moved abroad.